Hey viewers, my name's Cara. I'm your host for Tuesdays here on the Pagan Perspective, and this week we are pondering the topic of the first witch. This week's topic came from Tyler Evans, who wrote, "Here's my topic idea for you all, the first witch. I honestly have never thought about it much. Obviously, the practice of witchcraft has a long history that is for the most part well known, and information on it can be easily found. But how much information is there out there about the first witches, or the first people to call themselves such? I stumbled upon some Lithuanian myths about Ragana, referencing her as the first witch, and I've been obsessing about it all day. How much lore / myth / information is there out there of where witches began? Long before the names, the trials, and the resurfacing of the craft. Do you guys know of any legends or myths about early witches? I'd love to hear your thoughts." And that text will also be in the description of the video as well, so you can read it over yourself. So, the idea of the first witch is also not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. It's not something that concerns me in any kind of great way, but I think it's also to do with the fact that from the earliest years that I was even starting to study and learn about witchcraft and what is today known as paganism or neo-paganism, and the things that would therefore influence my path and bring me to where I am today, even from those early stages, it's made very clear in the information that you do find online when you research these things that the word witch has not always been used in the same way, and that it's always depended on who is using that word, and then realizing that, for example, when witchcraft is mentioned in the Bible, this is, of course, one of the first things that I looked up as a young kid, growing up raised by a Catholic family and coming into learning about witchcraft and paganism and wanting to kind of figure out what exactly does it say, why are there these mentions of witchcraft in the Bible at all, where do these sort of contradictory meanings of witchcraft come from. So early on, learning that things have been translated, things like the Bible, but also many other research documents, many other mentions in early literature and things like that. There are different words that have been used to describe who we would now refer to as witches, but were not necessarily translated as the word witch, if that makes sense. So historically, or even we could say in ancient civilizations, even prehistory, before things were recorded, we have this impression that whatever the words in the native culture and in the native language were that were being used, before there was any kind of negative connotation of using magic in a general sense, we have this impression that everyone in those cultures and in those societies practiced basically folk magic, or their own little things. They had their own little rituals, they had their devotions to their deities, and that was just what everyone did. There was no real separation between like the people who did these things and they were special and they were witches or whomever, and the people who didn't. It was something that everyone did and everyone practiced, and there might have been specialists in things like, you might have had the village healer, things like that. You might have had the midwives, you might have had your storytellers and your people who were experts in medicine, herbalism, things like that, right? So this is the idea that we have of it, right? We weren't actually there, at least not in this current lifetime, so all we really have is all this different research. And when you look through all that stuff, one of the first things you learn is that the word witch was not always used. So I think that's part of the reason why I've never really concerned myself with like who was the first witch or who were the first people to be called this, because early references of people being called witch, it was used negatively mainly. And so it would normally be other people calling someone a witch and meaning it in a bad way. But that person might have identified as simply a healer or an herbalist or whatever, you know, someone who practices folk magic, but where they come from, like, everyone does that, so it wasn't weird to them, you know? So these are things that came up kind of during conversion and cultures conquering other areas, other peoples, melding their cultures, or trying to suppress certain parts of cultures that were being conquered. And so a lot of stuff happened with the terminology and what people thought of as witchcraft and what they didn't. That is, I think, why, just for me, it's not really something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Now, I will say that, well, and also I wanted to note that Tyler said, obviously the practice of witchcraft has a long history that is for the most part well known, and information on it can be easily found. I agree with that statement as far as it applies to the history of, like, modern witchcraft, like what someone like me today in 2019, I identify as a witch and that I practice witchcraft. That history is pretty much well documented, and we can read about that anywhere online and in lots of books. You know, we know where certain teachers were initiated into groups or not, or created some things out of many different practices that they had learned, whatever, and initiated other people, and then they taught so-and-so, and that person taught another person, and now it's what it is today. We know that history. I wouldn't say that the overall practice of witchcraft is a history that is well known, because that's in essence what we're talking about here. It's that idea of who were the first people to do it, and a lot of that is prehistory. I do believe that that extends way, 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 way further into our history of humanity that is not all recorded and is not so clear-cut and not so easily known, because again, the words that were used are different and translated from different languages into the word we know as witch. And you can look up the etymology, the meaning, and the, you know, not just the definition, but why that word became the word that was being used for this type of practice in this group of people. You know, there's lots of different theories about, like, well, it was similar to this word which meant this, and it, you know, maybe it might have been this word that meant this, and these came together, and so we got witch, or we got the Wicca, or wherever these words came from, right? Bending, doing magic, wisecraft, cunning folk, all these different types of things. And I don't think that anyone actually knows any of that stuff from way, way, way early on in our history perfectly. I don't think that that information does exist. So I just wanted to point out, when we talk about the practice of witchcraft, long history that is mostly well known, I think Tyler may have been referring to, like, what we now know as witchcraft, like the stuff that I have all over my bookshelf here, that kind of witchcraft and what it is today. Yes, we know approximately where that came from, when it started being used, who started using the terms when. But as far as, like, ancient society and prehistory, no, I don't believe that that all exists. I had not heard of the Lithuanian myth that Tyler references, but one of the only really instances that I could think of off the top of my head, when you just say, like, hey, is there any lore or mythology about the first witch, or the first people to call themselves witches, or where witches came from, the first thing that I think of is Aradia, Gospel of the Witches by Charles Godfrey Leland, because this is a myth. Basically, it's folklore It is a story of the goddess Diana, because this is coming from Italian or Etruscan history and folklore. The goddess Diana being the supreme goddess. It is a story of her daughter Aradia being sent to Earth to teach magic and witchcraft to the people of Earth, and then essentially creating the first witches on Earth by teaching them witchcraft. And so in that sense, Aradia is considered the first of the witches, the one who teaches everyone else. It's not actually Diana who would be considered the first witch. I'm not exactly sure why. I read this years ago. I would have to reread it to see if that detail is in here. But Diana just remains the supreme goddess and is known as goddess of the witches. But Aradia, Diana's daughter, is actually, in this context, considered the first witch, the one who actually goes to Earth, is practicing it, is actively teaching it to humanity, and creating the first witches. That is the only version of such a tale about where witches came from, or the first witch or whatever, that I personally know, because I have a copy of it. I got it at the secondhand bookstore. I read it years ago, as I said, so I haven't read it multiple times. I haven't read it super recently. So it's not one of those things that is completely ingrained in my brain or anything like that. But there's that. I also know that there do exist other theories and tales that other people have, different ideas of other beings, whether it be the daughter of a goddess or, obviously similarly a son of God coming to Earth and teaching people things, whether it be a goddess or a god or some kind of deity or celestial figure, divine figure, whatever you want to call it, themselves coming to Earth and teaching people. I am recently hearing more, and I haven't really looked very far into any of these things yet, so I don't want to spend time in this video talking about them because I don't know enough about them yet. It's literally just still in the Googling stage. But I've been hearing more and more people mention these things, or I keep seeing someone mention it, and then a week later someone else will say something about it. So it's just snippets here and there. But it is now coming to my awareness and coming into my attention that there are other theories that people have about other beings coming to Earth and teaching people magic. And they all have this same sort of feel, right? That it's a mythology of a divine being or a divine presence that essentially already had that knowledge coming to Earth at some point in history and teaching it to people. These types of things in general, just in my path, are very much folklore and mythology, not to be offensive about anyone else's personal belief. Again, this is why we're sharing our personal perspectives on this channel. But these things to me are not something, although this is called Gospel of the Witches, these are not things that I take in my path as gospel, which of course is a phrase that we use often coming from Christianity, of basically taking the word of God or the word of the goddess as law and as total literal truth. These are not things that in my path I believed happen or had happened. So I don't believe that that is how witches were created. I don't think that's how it happened. But again, it's not something I've really spent a lot of time thinking about. It's nothing that in my personal practice I have my own creation story of witches in my head or in my practice. There is no specific bit of folklore that I believe in my practice this is where witches came from. I just kind of, you know, no, you don't know. That was not explanatory at all. But if you do know, that just means that we're on the same wavelength and you just know. It's the same way that I feel like anything in my practice, like, yes, I learned some things from books. I read them in books and then I practiced them, and that is how I know them. But there are also some things about my practice that I just walked out into the woods and sat there and meditated and got an idea in my head and started doing. And then later on learned that other people do it too. And that's the kind of thing that the term collective unconscious gets thrown around, where we think that sometimes even without picking up a book and reading the information in the book, or without someone's great-great-great-great-grandma who was a witch coming to you and teaching you this thing in person, you know, even without those sort of direct methods of education and passing down knowledge, that there are other ways that we receive knowledge. And I don't know for sure the origins of those things, and I'm okay with that. So this is another one of those topics where you could say I'm agnostic, in the sense that agnostic means we don't know. And we don't claim to know everything. And I'm pretty chill with the fact that we just don't really know. But I think for me, you know, as Tyler says, long before the names, long before the witch trials, long before the resurfacing of the craft and what we think of as the craft today. Because definitely if you Google it now, you might find information about Aradia that might come up. But even just now, when I tried Googling the first witch folklore or lore of the first witch, where witches came from, who was the first witch, stuff like that, most of the results that you get are about documented instances of the first person who was accused of witchcraft in various countries. So you'll find information about the first people who were accused of witchcraft in what is now called the Salem witch trials, all of that kind of area, which of course did not happen only in Salem, Massachusetts, but was more spread out than that. And you'll find information about the first person who was accused of witchcraft in Virginia, the first person who was accused of witchcraft in Connecticut, the first person accused in Ireland, in Germany, all sorts of places. That's sort of the information that's coming up, is the first person who was accused of witchcraft. Because really, in many cases where people have always been practicing these things that we think of as witchcraft, but no one was using the name witch for themselves, it's really hard to say anything else. You know, all you know is, well, this is the first person we accused of it. This is the first person that we think of witchcraft as a series of things and magic, and like these are the symptoms that we think exist of people doing negative witchcraft. And this is the first person we observed doing those things and accused them of witchcraft. Whether or not that person was actually practicing witchcraft doesn't really matter in those instances. It's not about what they actually did or didn't do. It's about the accusations in those stories and those circumstances. So, I mean, most of the people who died in witch trials all over the world, let alone just in Salem, because hello, that's not the only place they took place. There were many more much earlier in Europe, and it may be worth mentioning for those who don't know that people are still being accused of witchcraft and executed for it today all around the world. And you can sometimes find news articles about it. And if you were not aware of that and you think you might be able to handle some of that information, go ahead and look it up. I haven't come across anything myself that's been too graphic or gory or anything like that. But it's definitely something that, you know, you might have some serious feelings about as someone today who is lucky enough to live in an area of the world where we can openly say that we are witches and openly say that we practice witchcraft and that we use these terms, knowing that they have been used negatively in the past, knowing that a lot of people in the past and also today still don't use those words because of their negative connotations. And so they do use other words like healer, like magician, like light worker, like, you know, any other term that you hear people use. There are also practices that we consider witchcraft that exist within all of the main world's religions. There are practices that we recognize and say that's magic, that's witchcraft, but we know that it's never been called that by those people. And because of all of that, that's why it's difficult to say who were the first people to use these words, who were the first people to have these words applied to them by other people. What did this word actually mean? It's been translated to witch, but what was the word in the original language, and what did it mean to them? It might not have meant the same thing, you know? So there's just many, many paths. And yeah, if you feel like you are at a place where you could research what is still going on today in other areas of the world, it is something that I admit I was not aware of for much of the last decade, and it's only been within the past few years that I've started, because I research a lot of witchcraft-related stuff, and Google suggests articles to me that are about witches and things like that. There are more and more news stories that are popping up in my suggestions about things that are still done to people around the world today who are merely accused of witchcraft, not even necessarily practicing it. So yeah, the fact that I live in a country where, and this is, I just did a video on my personal channel this past weekend, naming a bunch of the people within basically what I consider the neo-paganism movement in the United States, but also anyone who we learned from, who came from European traditions, all of the teachers and authors who have influenced my path and a lot of our paths. I just did a video on that on my personal channel, so I'll link it or you can go check it out. But basically, knowing that I live in a place where all of those people came before me and have done so much work to give us legal recognition, to make it that much more socially acceptable, to the point where I have been able to be out as a witch for several years now, and to the point where every few years we go through these cycles like we are right now, where witchcraft is an incredibly popular thing and everybody wants to be a witch and call themselves a witch and post about it all over their social media. You know, we are incredibly lucky to be able to call ourselves witches today in any capacity. And that is not true of everyone everywhere around the world today. It's also not true of everyone throughout history, which I think is why stories like this, like, oh yeah, here's where witches came from, and, you know, here's who taught the first witches, are maybe not that easy to find, because we weren't always calling ourselves witches. So those are my long and convoluted thoughts about this topic. If anyone else has ideas or myths, folklore, heck, fairy tales that you know of, legends, whatever the word may be that applies there, of the first witch, or where witches came from, the first people to call themselves witches, please do share any of that information in the comments. Although I remind you, if you put a link in your comments, it will get flagged as spam. And because this is a shared channel, we do not always get around to going through all of the spam. So if you try to link a resource it will probably disappear. It will go to our spam folder and no one will be able to see it. So you might be better off just telling everyone maybe the name of the article to look for, or the website that it's from with a space, you know, in front of .com or whatever. Yeah, because if you have an actual link, it'll probably get sent to spam. Just wanted to let you know that. And I'll see you next month, because I believe next week is Subs Week. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Tyler, for this wonderful, thought-provoking topic. And I will see you next time. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.